evening, depending on where you are, and welcome or welcome back if you've just been with us on our previous panel. I'm Yulia Joja, Director and Senior Fellow of the Black Sea Program of the Middle East Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event on ethnic communities and societal resilience in the context of war, focusing on Moldova, Romania, and Bulgaria. Russia's aggression in the Black Sea countries and around them has targeted social vulnerabilities and exploited ethnic tensions in the Black Sea region for decades. This is not something new. Russia's full-scale war, however, has further exploited some of these vulnerabilities and has shed light on the issues that we're having in ethnic, cultural, and social contexts in and around the region. But it's also that slow and imperfect democratization processes that are taking place, economic hardship and inequality have had long-lasting effects on societal resilience and the formation of national identities that are inclusive, political, and democratic. This panel discussion brings together Black Sea Program research fellows to present their findings on societal resilience in Moldova and ethnic communities in Bulgaria, Moldova, and Romania. And the fellowship is sponsored by the United States State Department. I am happy and thrilled to be joined today by two panelists, and that's Elena Sirmizi and Lindsay Grutchfield, both Title VIII Black Sea Fellowship recipients. We have a lot to talk about in very limited time, also because in the case of Elena, she focused not on one, but on three countries. So I'm going to start with you, Elena, to give us a very broad, very superficial, and as short as possible overview of the actual communities that you've been looking at. Some in the region know some of them, but not all of them. And for our American or American-dominated audience, some of them will be very exotic and the first time they hear about them. So can you give us a bit of an overview of the three ethnic groups that you've looked at, the travel that you've done, who you talked to, and how you were actually, just in a matter of a few sentences, be able to differentiate among them before we get into some of the more interesting case studies in your research?
Thank you. Will gladly do so. So my research focused on three different ethnic groups in three communities in three states. With Moldova, I looked at Gagauz community, which is Turkish-speaking Orthodox community in the south of the country, with the autonomy region that has been in place since 1994, and the community itself is a very is very autonomous. So it's hard to sometimes for researchers to penetrate the wall between the community itself and the general population in Moldova. So it's a Russified community, which means that the primary languages there are Gagauz language and Russian language, with the Romanian language not being part of the linguistic landscape in general in these communities at all. So
do they learn Romanian at all in school?
Yes, they do learn Romanian at school, but there is no environment where they can practice it. So this has been a subject of debate for a very long time, and it has been a subject of conversations with many of the interviewees who I spoke to, and other primary subjects have been the political debates around the Ukraine and around the events that are happening in Ukraine, because there are Gagauz communities in Ukraine as well, and they're heavily affected by the war. So there is a tension there. And then other topics of interest that interviews brought up were media literacy and Russian propaganda in the region that is extremely heavy at this point. Other two communities that I looked at were CK Hungarians in Romania, which is an ethnic group in the center of the country, essentially in three counties of Romania. Those counties are primarily mountainous counties, and the villages and cities are pretty far removed from the center of the Romanian political life, from Bucharest. They are also characterized by the linguistic differences. Most of the CK Hungarians speak Hungarian or dialect of Hungarian language. They also, many of them are Catholic, so there is a religious difference there. And the third community that I looked at were Pomaks. Pomaks are is an ethnic group in Bulgaria. They are in most of their villages are in Rhodope Mountains, and this is a group that is primarily Muslim, Bulgarian speaking with a dialect of Bulgarian, and they have experienced during the past 150 years, they have experienced a very heavy-handed assimilation efforts from the communist government of Bulgaria and from its predecessor, the royal state of Bulgaria. So Pomaks are a bit different in my research from the other two groups that where the main focus was on linguistic language of the state language use and the minority state language uses and the propaganda.
And we'll get into that in a second. I should mention here that both Elena's and Lindsay's first articles based on their research findings from this summer have been published just a few hours ago with the Middle East Institute. You can find them on our website and on the sub-website of the Black Sea program and read up on some of the details that we will be touching upon, as well as further background reading. And I should also mention here that I look very much forward to taking audience questions. It's not just me who can ask questions, but our audience too. So I encourage you to do so. You can do that through the Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can find on your screens. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the YouTube live stream, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu or tweeting us at MEI. And if you have any technical issues, please email us on the same address, events@mei.edu. Over to you, Lindsay, and your research in Moldova, where you were based. You were based in Chisinau, but traveled across the region. It's not your first time being there. So maybe you can mention some of the background that you've had and experience in Moldova. But this time with this fellowship, you focus particularly on societal resilience that is a challenge in itself in this significant context of the war and the pressure that Moldova across regions is perceiving, and I think we'll get into that with Elena a little bit later into as well. And so when you're looking at societal resilience, in Moldova, what was the process that you adopted to be able to focus in? Why did you focus in on specific aspects of social and societal resilience? And specifically, what role is government in Moldova playing in that, both at the central, national level, as well as the local government level? What's the interaction between the regular Moldovan citizen, their perception of leadership and resilience, and how they're interacting with their administrators and governance level?
Yeah, so I will do my best to answer all of those questions. And if I miss one, just prompt me a little bit, because there's lots to talk about, and I could talk about Moldova for ages. I was a Peace Corps volunteer there in 2019 until the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. So that's sort of the background and perspective that I'm coming from in looking at Moldova. I chose to focus on societal resilience, which is something of a buzzword across sort of different professional and academic communities. It can be kind of poorly defined at times. And so because of that, I needed to make sure that in order for this framework to be at all useful, to really sort of narrow in on how I was defining social resilience and what aspects of it I was looking at. And so basically, where I was coming from here is that Moldova is sort of in the international media spotlight for the first time since independence, I would argue, or to this extent for the first time due to the war in Ukraine. And for many Americans, this is the first time really that they're hearing about Moldova, that they're learning something about the political or social or cultural situation of Moldova. And many times, because this is in relation to a war in a neighboring country, that coverage is sort of through a very international lens, through the lens of Moldova's relationship with Russia, Moldova's relationship with Ukraine, Moldova's relationship with the West, this administration versus the previous administration, et cetera. And so in choosing to focus on societal resilience and societal resilience at the kind of local municipal level specifically, I hope to sort of add dimension to that, to those narratives and provide a little bit more context that's Moldova specific to some of those overarching themes which get a lot of coverage. And so I chose to sort of define social resilience using the definition that I felt most applied to Moldova and to Moldovan communities specifically, which is the ability of a community to adapt or resist the impacts of change or the hazards that they face. And that's a definition that's sort of taken from disaster preparedness or disaster response, but has been applied across fields as well. And because of the kind of acute dangers of the war in Ukraine to Moldova's territorial integrity and autonomy, I felt that that was an appropriate definition. So within that, again, because I wanted to add sort of a Moldova-centric focus, I wanted to make sure that I was focusing on communities themselves. And to that extent, I chose to focus on societal resilience from the perspective of self-organization as a form of social resilience and as something that is necessary for social resilience. And there's a fair bit of literature on that that I won't go into because I don't think we really have the time. But a couple of factors across that literature and the factors that I chose to focus on were economic equity, access to reliable and trustworthy public information, and social ties and networks and attachment to place, which I sort of grouped into one. And so those three factors were sort of what defined my research. And in focusing on those three factors, I focused in on how community leadership connects to those factors, and specifically how local and national government connects to those factors. It would be fair to say, and this came up a lot in my research, that community leadership often does exist in Moldova outside of the government in the form of religious leaders, whether those are leaders of the Orthodox Church or of smaller, sort of more niche religious groups, which do exist in Moldova. And as well, community leadership. Some of my interviewees pointed to educational leaders as being very sort of important leaders in their communities. And as much as I would have loved to incorporate that in my research, I found that particularly with religious leaders, but for educational leaders as well, there could be a whole book written about sort of their place in Moldova in their communities in Moldova and their leadership there. So in the end results of my research, and as I was sort of processing all of this data that I collected, I chose to focus on community leadership through the lens of governance and the extent to which local government versus national government are sort of seen as leaders and holding the trust of their communities. And then as well, something that emerged from this is the extent to which you can't take the international out of the national in Moldova, and the extent to which foreign donors and of course Russian influence plays into governance as well, and particularly foreign donor organizations, whether those are national, multinational, or private charities.
And I want to ask you about that, but I'd love to stay a little bit with Moldova and with local government and turn to Elena. I saw her nodding and smiling as Lindsay was talking. I'd like to ask you to zoom in on the Gagauz community that probably has made it to the news to some people here and there, the first time they ever heard about it. And you know the community well. You've been now meeting and visiting the community this summer. And this was in a particularly important context because we've had local elections. And I think you would argue, I certainly would, that the effects of these elections are still unfolding. So can you create a little bit of context for us to tell us what these elections in terms of political implications consist of, and how the members of the Gagauz community how they are relating to, at the local level, to elections, to government officials, to their participation within elections. And then maybe if we have a chance, we'll zoom out a bit later and compare that to central government, look at Russia's influence that Lindsay was referring to just a bit earlier, but immerse us a bit into the Gagauz political community.
Yeah, I was smiling because I realized I forgot to answer your third question during the first answer. So, to give the context, and feel free to stop me because I can talk again for hours about the community and about these specific elections, because I think they were phenomenal in a way, how different they were from majority of elections that were going on in Moldova in the past 30 years. So Gagauz community, as I said, has, well, first of all, it has its own autonomy within Moldova, and it's a political and cultural autonomy where there is a head of the autonomy, which is called Bashkan, and then there is a national assembly, which is a legislative body for the autonomy. And these elections were where people were choosing the new Bashkan for the autonomy. So to set up a little bit the historical narrative around the elections. The previous Bashkan have been in power for 8 years, and she has been the most popular Bashkan in the region, and at least that's how the interviewees pointed out, the least corrupt Bashkan in the region. Whether it's true or not, it's hard to tell, but the perception exists about it in the community. So and why I'm saying that the current elections were, or the elections that just passed, were very interesting because the people who participated in it, and specifically the person who won the elections, were not part of the Gagauz establishment. So the party that presented the candidate that won was a Shore party that is currently prohibited in Moldova, and the Constitutional Court, I believe, decided after the elections that the party had illegal funding, and the party has been prohibited. However, the elections have passed, and the candidate won, and there are questions on how she won. There are obviously, as with everything in Moldova, there is a question of corruption, and there is a question of where the money come from.
Does she have to become independent of that party because the party has been banned, or can she stay within the autonomy as a party member of Shore?
It's ambiguous.
Of course, like everything in Moldova.
Like everything, it depends. Like everything with Moldova, it depends. And the problem is that the Bashkan, the newly elected Bashkan, doesn't want to detach herself from the party. So that's the main issue, or appears not to want to detach. And the Shore, the leader of the party, who has been in exile since, I would say, 2020. I don't remember exactly year, but he has been in exile, and he has several criminal proceedings pending against him. So he occupied a very prominent place in her administration, meaning that there were video conferences conducted with the proposed cabinet for Bashkan. There were video conferences conducted with the mayors of the villages, where he, as a leader of the party, promised certain projects to be done locally, certain projects to be done on an autonomy scale. And some of the mayors refused to meet with him, but some obviously did meet. And it's up to be seen what is going to happen next because of the questions on how this communication occurred and why it occurred. Because he's obviously not a person within the executive branch of the autonomy power. So why the communication occurs in that realm of Zoom calls is a very weird situation, and it hasn't been seen, and there is no central government doesn't have a response to it, as well as the autonomy government. They struggled with the political and legal response to those events that have been happening.
It is a question of novelty, and beyond this banned party and ambiguous role of it in the autonomous region of Gagauz. What do people feel is the future of political leadership there, given how controversial the current Bashkan is, and given this unprecedented situation? Do you feel through your research that the relationship between voters and elected officials is changing in this particular, particularly challenging context of the war?
So I think if we outline 4 different parties to this situation, the central government of Moldova, then a newly elected Bashkan with the executive branch of the government that she currently tries to put together. And then 2 other parties being Gagauz establishment, the Gagauz political leadership that has been in place for the past 30 years, that hasn't accepted her. And this being a super traditional society, this is very important that majority of the leaders locally, and as Lindsay noted, the educational leaders, leaders of the religious leaders, leaders of the various economic groups have not accepted her as a leader of the autonomy, and this is very important. And so the the 4th party being electorate, people who voted in the elections. So I think it's a very intricate balance that she has to strike, and so far she hasn't. And this great opportunity for, I think, for the autonomy and for central government to turn their relationships around, because the relationships has been strained. And with this invasion of Shor's party in the autonomy's political landscape, it's a great way, great turning, could play as a great turning point for the autonomy leadership and for the population and for the central government to cooperate and get rid of people who are just trying to ride on a wave of current economic crisis, current energy crisis, and occupy the space that they have no idea what to do in, really.
So I want to zoom out a little bit now and look at the international, regional and international context that I think particularly our audience is interested in, to put things into perspective. And I'm turning to you, Lindsay, with a question that we're getting from the audience for you, and then I'll add mine to it. With the context that you just said, you can't take the international out of the national. One question that we've gotten from Rosemary Berry is, she's arguing that what she remembers about Moldova was the mafia and the fact that local politicians had short lives. And she's asking whether this is what you're referring to when you're using the term networks. And so talk to us about your perception, your research of Moldovan networks, as well as networks in the context of international NGOs, international donors, and what role they're playing on the ground, as well as in the perceptions of Moldovans.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important to note here that Moldova is a place that has changed a great deal over the past several years, the past decade. And part of that is simply that, everywhere in the region was profoundly affected by a global pandemic, the war in Ukraine. Moldova has had the highest rates of inflation over the past year in Europe, if you discount Turkey. And then part of that also is this new administration, which has, well, I guess not that new now, since 2019, 2020, that has made kind of anti-corruption a priority. And while it's not fully clear, and I'm also not really in a position to definitively say one way or another, corruption is like vanquished in Moldova, or or even necessarily that the new administration has been wholly successful in their or the current administration has been wholly successful in their anti-corruption efforts. I think it is worth noting that the kind of the mafia, organized crime, is not necessarily at the forefront of what people talk about when they talk about corruption in Moldova today.
It's passé.
It's a little bit passé, yeah. And so when I talk about networks, I'm talking about something, and interpersonal networks, I'm talking about something far more boring, which is much more that Moldova is a rural country. According to Moldovan government statistics, more than half of the country still lives in rural areas, and there are only a few cities with more than 100,000 people. So this is a rural country, this is an agricultural country, and this is a country where the majority of the population lives in small villages or smallish towns. And what that means is that, the distance between mayors primarily, but also, town councils and their constituents is very, very small. And so personal relationships with the mayor or with the local government and the local leadership are very important, but not necessarily, I think it's important to conceptualize this not necessarily as like a large-scale corruption, organized crime family type of a perspective, but much more from just the sense that when your town has, or your village has 80 people, everybody's going to know the mayor. And the fastest way to kind of have your voice heard is to call the mayor personally via WhatsApp. One of my interviewees this summer was the mayor of a kind of mid-sized town by Moldovan standards. And he pointed out that everyone in the town has his personal WhatsApp number. And when they need something, they just call him. And I can attest to that because his phone really kept ringing throughout our interview. But the point here is that when we talk about personal networks and social networks and networks of local governments, it's not necessarily a matter of kind of organized crime or large-scale corruption. It's more a matter of the way that Moldovans conceptualize getting things done is via local government or reliance on their neighbors rather than the national government. And we saw this particularly this past winter, which was incredibly difficult financially for a lot of Moldovans. Energy prices skyrocketed due to the whole Russian energy crisis influence mess of the fall, although certainly not to the extent that it looked like they might for a short while. And it's worth mentioning too that the national government was able to mitigate to a certain extent with direct financial support the prices that people were paying for energy. But again, inflation, the prices of goods went up. The war in Ukraine certainly had an effect on that too. Life got very difficult this winter for a lot of Moldovans. And one thing that my interviewees noted as how people responded to these challenges and changes is that they relied on remittances or financial support from their friends and neighbors. They utilized kind of creative solutions born out of living through times of hardship in the past, such as moving to outbuildings in the winter because they're easier to heat and cheaper to heat. And they turned to their local mayors for support. And the extent to which those mayors were able to help is, varies and is extremely limited, but there's this sense that personal relationships, not only with figures of power such as they are, but with your neighbors, with your family, with your friends, are incredibly important. And that because that distance between constituents and mayors or town councilors is so small, there's a sense that your voice can be heard. And that's one thing that is sort of at the center of my research, is that that doesn't necessarily apply to the national government. There has long been a sense in Moldova that the national government is extremely partisan and is extremely sort of distant and not very transparent in how money, whether that's public funds or donated money from abroad, kind of makes its way from the national government to the local level. And as a result, that's something that may be beginning to change a little bit. The Moldovan government, national government, recently instituted a program called European Village, Satul European, which allows mayors to apply pretty directly for funds earmarked for a specific infrastructure project. And those funds are both public funds and funds which come via donations from foreign donor organizations through the national government. And that's something that my interviewees pointed out is a change, both in the sense that it's direct, it's relatively transparent and like relatively easy to apply as well. And also in the sense that those programs getting funded are not kind of constrained by party lines. It's not just the mayors who belong to the same political party as the current administration who are having their projects funded. And that's something that's very new in Moldova. So none of that's to say that corruption has disappeared. None of that is to say that you know, the national government is corrupt and local mayors are completely trustworthy. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. But I think that it's worth noting that when we look at kind of how Moldovans see local versus national government, it's very different. And they see local government as someone who like they can interact with very directly and they can have their voice heard, whether corruption is involved in like what that government subsequently does. And Ilan Shor, the exiled leader of the now illegal Shor Party, is kind of in his tenure as mayor was sort of a classic example of holding a lot of favor with his constituents because they felt heard and because they felt he was doing things for them.
Very hands-on.
Very hands-on. Very hands-on. But you know, he's doing all of that with funds acquired via alleged financial crimes.
Yeah,
so
I think it's important to differentiate here. And I think you've done a great job at showing the nuances of perception and corruption, of course, in central and as well as local government. To stay a bit more in the broader context, I want to turn to you, Elena, with a twofold question about Turkic minority and Turkic influence. One is a question that we've gotten from Anne Phillips about the relationship, if any, between the Turkic minority and the Pomaks in Bulgaria. Do they cooperate politically or economically? And something that again is a bit less known, but I'd like to ask you about too, is the relationship between Turkish entities, government or non-governmental, and the Gagauz minority as well. So can you tell us a little bit about where Turkic and Turkish influence is in the region?
Yes, so with Pomaks, I would start with Pomaks because the influence there is primarily through the religious organizations, and it's a very soft power influence, meaning that, yes, the organization leaders often go study in Turkey, and they prepare the Muslim leaders for the mosques in the Pomak villages. However, there hasn't been, at least the interviewees haven't recognized or haven't mentioned, even asked the findings or any type of media efforts on a Turkish side to get involved into Pomak community. I have to say that there is a Turkish community in Bulgaria, which is a
Mhm.
very different community, and they are very clearly differentiated from Pomaks. So the story there is different, obviously. But with Pomaks, they, to my big surprise, first of all, they recognize themselves as European citizens, as citizens of European country. And then, so their scale of identity is very different from Turkish minority. So
Interesting.
yes, the first thing that they're saying is that we are Europeans. And then the next section would be we are Pomaks, and then the third one, we are Bulgarians. So this is usually how the conversation goes, because they like to set up the narrative landscape around their identity recognition. And then with Gagauz minority, the Turkish presence and Turkish presence, meaning that there are other states that are communicating directly with Gagauz leadership, states such as Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, they all have been involved and all have been supporting economically Gagauz autonomy. So two major points on that. Gagauz education, Gagauz language education is being supported primarily by that funding, as well as social support services such as elderly services, such as firefighter stations are being sponsored by various Turkish governments. Turkey is being viewed as a big brother, I would say. If you would see the videos from several years ago when Erdogan visited Gagauzia, you would understand the extent of the relationship, and it has been viewed in the community as a positive relationship. Whereas I would want to contrast it, I guess, with the Russian relationship, with the relationship to Russia, there is always caveat of big brother pushing.
Good big brother, not so good big brother.
Yes, exactly. Too many big brothers in that case, I guess. But so there are schools, there are libraries established by the Turkish government. They are sponsoring higher education. So students from Gagauzia are welcomed in Turkish universities, and they study there for free. And they receive the stipend, which is a big deal in a frame of economic crisis that has been going on for the past 30 years. So on another hand, a very quick note that there is always this undercurrent of Romanian language education in the region, and in 2022, there has been an effort on Turkish government part to promote Romanian education in Gagauzia. Specifically, there have been several envoys coming in from Turkey and talking with Gagauz leadership, where they directly told the Gagauz leadership that the education, state language education, has to be ramped up, has to get to the place where the community is a whole and is able to reject a bit, I would say reject the influence of the other foreign states.
Interesting.
Yeah. So.
We'll leave it at that in a suspenseful note, and I'll ask you both one quick question. We have just 3 more minutes left. So in 1 minute, if you are to sum up, based on the research that you've conducted in this summer, Russian malign influence in form and shape, as well as in impact across the communities? I know that for Elena, this will be a harder question because she has 3 communities to focus on. So you can't do that in 1 minute. You pick one, maybe you'll pick Gagos because I know you focused on that too, but feel free to look at any of the other 2. And then for Lindsay, overall in Moldova, how that it is assessed and how that came through the interviews that you conducted in the context of this next door full-scale invasion. Tell us that, and then we'll wrap it up. So maybe we'll start with Lindsay.
Sounds good. I only have one country to talk about, so I'll answer first.
Or one to pick from, yes.
That's true. So I think that it's worth first and foremost contrasting the kind of face of Russian influence in Moldova with sort of the face of Western influence in Moldova as well. We didn't really have time to get into it so much, but it's difficult to overstate the presence of Western, international, and multinational kind of development aid and humanitarian aid in Moldova. And that's I could talk for probably another hour about that. But that's sort of what that's how Western countries are sort of perceived as existing in the Moldovan space. In contrast, Russian influence in Moldova looks like, of course, the omnipresent disinformation, the tremendous financial influence over the energy sector, which we really saw flare up in the fall, and then as well, political influence in the form, probably most visibly, of the Shore Party. And I'm sure Elena will have more to say about that. Kind of within the scope of my research, probably the most dynamic aspect of Russian influence in Moldova at present might be in the form of disinformation. The entertainment sector in Moldova is very Russian language focused. So that's, the issue of language in Moldova is an ongoing one, and Elena has spoken about it in the context of Gagauzia. But the Russian entertainment sector is incredibly well developed. And so even Romanian speaking Moldovans, even Moldovans who don't necessarily think positively of Russia or use a lot of Russian or you think about Russia at all, primarily consume movies and entertainment in Russian. And so that plays a big role in that even people who aren't necessarily getting their news in Russian are watching movies made in blockbuster movies made in Russia, which might take a Russian worldview, or are turning the TV on in the background to have a game show play, and there's a Russian news broadcast after that. And so I think that it's worth noting that while of course we often speak about Russian disinformation as something that comes through kind of news channels directly, and that's certainly a presence in Moldova. The Moldovan government banned 6 Russian language media outlets for spreading disinformation, which has, as a side note, sort of opened up a whole conversation in Moldova on censorship and the extent to which it's possible to kind of ban news, and to what extent where disinformation stops and differing perspectives begin, which is a large part of the discussion around Russian disinformation. But it's also worth noting that that information, or that information that was kind of being dispersed by those 6 outlets has just moved to other channels, particularly social media. And that's something that was brought up a lot. And then as well, that oftentimes consumption of Russian media and Russian disinformation is much less sort of centered around sitting down and watching a TV broadcast on a specific channel, and is much more just sort of insidious in the sense that it's everywhere in entertainment, because there's just not a very well-developed Romanian language entertainment sector, much less a Moldovan, like homegrown one. And then as well in the form of social media and sort of passive consumption of social media.
All right. And then Elena?
Yeah. And I just will focus on Moldova and Gagauz community. And I agree with everything what Lindsay said. That's definitely the case. And one more point to add is that many Moldovans and many Gagauz, it's throughout the whole country, have relatives and friends in Russia. So that is another channel where the spread of disinformation occurs. At least somebody from the family, somebody who they know, friends, former classmates are either currently in Russia or have Russian citizenship or used to live there for a long time or had an education there. So that is a very significant channel. And Russia has specifically targeted Moldova for their citizenship, second citizenship efforts, and have been granting citizenship to Moldovan citizens on a continuous basis throughout past 30 years. So
it's a particular focus on the Gagauz community, or?
No, I would say on a particular focus to the Russian-speaking communities in general, Ukrainian-speaking communities as well, and some Moldovan-speaking communities that are close to Transnistria region, and that's the whole other game there. Yes, so this is one of the channels that is often overlooked, and
the
that is
passportization of Ruski Mir.
Yes,
right?
exactly. And this is a much harder topic. And how do you resist that as a state? How do you resist that as an autonomy or ethnic minority? That is a big question.
You certainly left us with a bunch of big questions. So thank you to both of you for immersing us and highlighting to us what is going on in the Black Sea region in terms of social resilience and ethnic communities in the context of the full-scale invasion. A big thank you to our audience for tuning in and for engaging with us. And keep an eye out on our newsletters and MEI products that are coming out on the Black Sea region and the Middle East region in general every day. So stay tuned with us. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time.